I'm going to tell you a true story, which we refer to in this training as a vignette, and offer you 4 possible solutions. Please listen carefully. There is a response that is correct for this specific scenario because it is written from a real-life situation as shared by First Nation people. But the incorrect answers also contain valuable information, and you will be asked to recognise the key learnings. He is a sick old man, so why is he still travelling all over the countryside and ignoring health issues? John, a local GP, liked Frank, an old Aboriginal Australian man who regularly attended his clinic for a serious heart condition, gout and ingrown toenails. During his visits, the GP learnt that Frank was an elder and a leader of his clan and was widely respected by the local Queensland community in which he had been born and continues to reside. He also had extended family based in West Australia, a great distance away. After Frank had a heart attack, the GP made home visits and took time to ensure Frank understood the importance of taking the required medication, the diet modification and foot care regime. The GP always checked Frank's feet and trimmed his toenails when necessary to avoid complications from immobility and gout. When Frank visited the GP after a gap of 8 weeks, the GP was annoyed to discover Frank's health had deteriorated and a large lesion had formed because of an untrimmed, ingrown toenail. On questioning him, the GP was surprised to learn that Frank and his wife had been visiting family in Western Queensland and had not had access to any primary health care services. Fortunately, the old man had sufficient medication supplies with them, but although he knew his toenails needed regular trimming, he was under the impression that this was a task that only the GP could perform. So, what explanation could there be for Frank's actions? Response A. The old man doesn't understand the seriousness of his illness or the importance of proper foot care. This is a reasonable response and indicates that you are aware of the potential for confusion and misunderstanding when communicating with Indigenous people. It helps when communicating with Indigenous people to remember First Nations peoples prefer and generally use an indirect style of communication. First Nations people often don't like to bring conflict into a situation and will say yes to almost every question rather than risk disapproval or an argument. When conversing with First Nation peoples, you should avoid aggressive and confrontational style communications. Silence may indicate a person is finding what you say difficult to understand, or it may indicate that they are undecided or hesitant about their opinion of your decision. You should watch for non-verbal communications such as eye, face and body movements. You should avoid jargon and instead speak clearly and simply. It is helpful to use visual tools to help communications. Try to ensure that any questions you may have address only one issue at a time, and also be careful and be aware that questions with this or that scenario may meet with a yes answer that is in response to only one part of the question. In the First Nations worldview, it may be considered rude to reply to these scenario types of question with an outright no. Avoid direct questioning such as, when do you do this? How often? How many? And so on. Instead, use indirect questions such as, how does it make you feel? Can you have a yarn about it? I will refer you to the free Yarning for Beginners course offered by Cultural if you would like to know more. It is important not to use double negatives, such as, don't you know, it's not okay to drink more than 4 beers. Listen carefully and check that you have understood the responses and also that you have been understood. It is worth mentioning that the GP had built a rapport with the old man and also had taken time to ensure that both Frank and his wife understood the seriousness of his condition. So is this the correct response? Response B. The old man does understand the seriousness of his illness and is preparing his family for his death. First Nations people place great importance on connection to country and family. Although John was aware of this, he had assumed that as Frank was seriously ill, his family would travel to his hometown to visit him before he died. However, the First Nations people's concept of family obligation and reciprocity dictate that Frank had an obligation to prepare his family for his passing, and his extended family had an obligation to reciprocate by extending hospitality when he visited. First Nations people may also have strict codes relating to confidentiality. In this case, it was the old man's responsibility to share his news with extended family, as no one else had the authority to do so. When caring for Indigenous peoples, it is prudent to consider their potential strong connection to country and their broad kinship ties, which often result in the need to travel for extended periods. In this situation, had John been aware of Frank's responsibilities, he could have shown him and his wife how to trim his toenails properly and thus avoid potential problems. It is also common for an elderly Indigenous person to designate a family member to take control or coordination of his or her health. It may be helpful to ask, who's helping you look after your health? If necessary, ask that person to attend with the patient to discuss any issues or concerns. So, is this the correct response? Response C. The old man doesn't trust modern medicine and chose to ignore John's advice. First Nations people generally have high rates of non-compliance with medication and treatment. Effective communication from a GP or other health and medical professional requires 1. Involvement of other key family members, building rapport, establishing trust between patient and clinician. These are all important aspects in improving compliance. Indigenous people may also use traditional medicine as an alternative to a doctor's prescription. However, there is nothing to indicate that Frank doesn't trust modern medicine, and it would be unlikely for the old man to visit the GP regularly if he did not trust his advice. So is this the correct response? Finally, response D. The old man understood and accepted the GP's care instructions, but it was important for him to visit his family, and so he put the information aside to deal with later. First Nations people have a different concept of time. It differs markedly from the Judeo-Christian absolute concept of time. Its linear approach to the past, present, and future conflicts with First Nations people's understanding that time, past, present, future evolves in a now moment. The past is now. The present is now and the future is now. First Nations peoples often place events in a circular pattern of time whereby they perceive issues of individual and community importance as being closer in time. Stephen Hawking describes this relative concept of time in A Brief History of Time from the Big Bang to Black Holes, which stated, "Up to the beginning of this century, people believed in an absolute time. That is, each event could be labelled by a number called time in a unique way, and all good clocks would agree on the time interval between two events." However, the discovery that the speed of light appeared the same to every observer, no matter how he was moving, led to the theory of relativity. And in that, one had to abandon the idea that there was an unique absolute time. Instead, each observer would have his own measure of time as recorded by a clock that he carried. Clocks carried by different observers would not necessarily agree. Thus, time became a more personal concept relative to the observer who measured it. The laws of science do not distinguish between the past and the future. While a First Nations patient may understand the importance of following treatment instructions, other issues of individual and community importance may mean that he perceives treatment as distant in time and thus gives it a low priority. This is particularly common with chronic conditions that may appear to be stable and thus distant in time. Professionals or frontline workers confronted with this dilemma should reinforce the need to comply with ongoing treatment and the consequences of non-compliance. The aim of helping the patient maintain a more short-term perspective on their healthcare will ensure better outcomes. So, is this the correct response? Now, considering the four responses that I have shared, in the next section, you will need to choose the response you believe to be correct. Was it A, B, C, or D? After that, you will be asked how you can apply this knowledge in your professional, community, or personal life. Go well, stay well, and be well.